Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What was your, this person is a psychopath moment when meeting someone? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I met a dude when I was 18, going over to his house to play Call of Duty with some friends that knew him. The guy was in his early 30s. Dude started talking about how he'd only had one job in his life and got fired the first week by calling a bunch of customers the N-word. He thought it was hilarious. Then he went on about how it was cool because his parents had almost $500,000 saved up for retirement, but they'd both be dead before retirement because they were so obese and unhealthy, so he'd be set for life when they died. He asked my friends if they wanted to buy some medicine he stole from his mom before pulling a shotgun out of his closet and asking if any of us wanted to hold it. He said he wanted to get some more fingerprints on it in case anything happened. He tried to play it off like he was joking, but he seemed like the type of person that would kill his family for the insurance money. As of last year, he's in prison for embezzlement and prescription fraud. He made the newspaper when he was arrested, and I followed the case. I was just surprised it wasn't for a violent crime. I was working as a third-shift hotel manager on Valentine's Day weekend 2019. Think of it as a small mom-and-pop hotel with 22 rooms and no cameras on the premises. This guy came in, and he was smooth-talking about how he's going to pick up his girlfriend and a special surprise for her Valentine's Day. He then continued with a weird religious spiel about honoring your partner. A few hours go by, and I hear the back door open. I walk through the lobby to see a weird guy and what I assumed to be his girlfriend. Shortly after, I heard whimpering down the hallway. I thought this crazy-ass man got his girl a puppy. It's a pet-free facility, and a guest had made a noise complaint about thuds and puppy whimpers. I knocked on the door to address the dog issue. He opened the door, and his girlfriend, bloody and bruised, came running out of the room and hid behind me, just sobbing. Keep in mind, I was 28, 5'1", and 105 pounds soaking wet. He quickly closed the door and barricaded himself in the room. As I was on the phone with emergency services, the girl told me that he R'd her immediately after they got into the room. Police arrived within minutes and were able to get him to come out. I had to clean the room that night to get the blood stains off of the wall from where he smashed her face into it. I'll never forget his name. I saw him several months later in public. I don't think he recognized me, but seeing his eyes meet mine scared the hell out of me. One day as a teen, a friend showed up with a classmate who we had never really hung out with before that day. He found an occupied bird's nest in my window awning and flipped it, causing fledgling little birds to glide in several different directions. No sign of parents. They couldn't quite fly yet. I went around trying to gather the little birds I could spot in a possibly hopeless attempt to put the nest back up and put the birds in it. This took a few minutes of treading carefully while scanning the grass left and right. Then I hear the freak kid say, "You guys won't be mad, will you?" I look up and he's holding a cinder block over his head, standing over one of the birds I hadn't found yet. I said, "Yes, I will," and he just dropped the block on the bird. Kid was a piece of shit, and we never associated after that. I was working as a night shift security guard in an apartment complex. I got a frantic call from a resident I could barely understand. The majority of our tenants were foreign students from China. I went up there and the tenant beckons me into his apartment. He had just moved in. Inside was a woman covered in blood holding her arm. I get them calmed down enough that I can understand what they're saying. She was his neighbor. She had broken up with her boyfriend, who pulled a knife and started trying to convince her to do mutual suicide with him. She made a break for the door, and he slashed her on the way out. The neighbor, hearing the commotion, let her in and called me. The wound is extremely deep. The neighbor is already on the phone with the police, and I tell both of them to stay put. I'm going to go get my first aid kit and come back. I tell them not to open the door unless it's me or the police. I got to retrieve my kit and come back. When I got back, the neighbor's door is open, and he's freaking out. Says the victim went back to her apartment to get her ID. People do some really bizarre things when they're panicking. I thought to myself, this is the dumbest thing I'll ever do. Then I went into her apartment. No weapons, not even body armor. I find her in her bedroom and tell her to forget the ID. We can sort that out later. When we went to leave, the ex-boyfriend was between us and the door, knife in hand. I'm standing between him and the victim. They're speaking Mandarin, which I only know a tiny bit of, so I can't understand what they're saying, but she's crying and pleading with him to stop. He, on the other hand, was stone cold. His voice was perfectly flat and even with no inflection at all, no emotion in it. He's standing perfectly still, not even shaking from adrenaline. He's not blinking, he's looking at her in the eye, and then he's looking at me and sizing me up before looking back at her. I could tell that in that moment, the only thing he was thinking about was whether he could kill me fast enough to get to her before she got away. In that moment, my only thought was, I'm going to have to kill him if either of us are going to survive this. I could just tell that there was no reasoning with him, and he was quickly figuring out that I'm not armed. There was a moment that probably only lasted a second, but felt like minutes, where me and him were both silent, just staring at each other, eyes locked, waiting for the other person to make the first move. In that moment, the elevator dinged and 2 cops came out. My ex-boyfriend barricaded himself in the bathroom next to him, and I got the victim out of there and ran back to the neighbor's apartment. I've never been so relieved to see the police. At a bar in Frankfurt, Germany, talking to military stories with a soldier who is a former sailor. We both spent time in Subic Bay, Philippines. He starts laughing as he's telling a story about how a house manager at a brothel yelled at him for asking for a 12-year-old girl. He says at first she looked confused, and then once she found out he was serious, he forced him out of the brothel and called him a bad person, and he just laughed his way through the story. I was shocked and confused and kept waiting for the punchline. That sick son of a bitch was telling the truth. I told him that I agreed with the old woman that he was an effed up person and needed to seek help. We parted ways pretty quickly after that, with him accusing me of being gay or something. I never saw him again, but I feel sorry for other people who don't know his true nature. When I was about 18, I helped a friend move. Dude was a weirdo, but I thought he was okay. I didn't really know him. He talked about his cat, but I never saw it. I thought it was in a cage somewhere. After a couple of hours of hauling stuff, he opens the freezer. There's the cat, jumping out and running for its life. I was so pissed, but the guy laughed and was like, well, it's a hot day, and I also did not want it to leave while we moved boxes. Like there was no other solution. He thought it was the funniest shit. Cat got out, and we never saw it again. I hope it didn't get frostbite. It was in there for at least 2 to 3 hours. I got chatting to a girl at work once. We went out for lunch because she seemed cool and ended up sitting at the edge of a canal munching sandwiches. There's a pigeon with a gammy leg hanging around, hoping to get some food. She lured it closer and closer to her with bits of bread as we were talking, and when it got close enough, she just knocked it into the canal. Turned around to me laughing her ass off like it was the funniest thing ever, and was shocked that I wasn't impressed. Putting a cat in the freezer. It's probably good you don't keep in touch with that person. I was in the army, mandatory conscription, and I had this bunkmate who was not very well educated. We would be guarding the gate of our unit at night from 2 to 6 a.m. and not allowed to leave our post, so I couldn't get away from him. He told me stories of how he strangles cats and throws them off rooftops or plucks the feathers of caged birds and then releases them to watch them fall to their deaths. There was a cat that lived in our unit, and whenever he saw it, he would kick it into the wall. When she birthed a huge litter, our CO wanted to poison them, and he volunteered to get the poison and feed them himself. The mother cat wailed for days on end looking for them because she had left them and couldn't find them when she returned because he had thrown them in the garbage after they died. There was this weird kid who came to our school in the middle of the year. People didn't like him that much because he was rude and liked to shove other kids during recess, but he kept to himself about half the time, so nobody was really that wary of him. I was a kid who got bullied a decent amount, and at that time I didn't have many friends, so my 12-year-old brain figured maybe he just needed a friend too. I saw him out by my neighbor's house messing with something on the ground. Beyblades were a whole thing in the neighborhood, so I assumed it was something like that. I went to say hi. As I approached, he picked up his scooter and crushed some twigs or something. Reader, I got closer and discovered that it was a pigeon. He had knocked one out of the air with a rock somehow and had been slowly prodding and crushing it. It was squirting blood. I avoided him until he was transferred out later in the year. Roommate meets a dude and invites him over for a beer. The dog would not chill when the guy was in the house. Ears back, hackles raised, continuous growl. An otherwise friendly dog just lit up. It was a very contagious feeling, and we were all on edge except the guy who acted like it was a natural response. A few months later, the guy went to prison for the violent assault of a stranger. I went round to this guy's house to pick up an old Wurlitzer organ. Seemingly fairly normal, I had seen him around town, lived somewhere pretty remote, and the biggest town was about 2,000 people. He did stuff like gardening and things, bit of voluntary work like some maintenance at the old folks' home, cutting the grass and hedges at a couple of the churches, general handyman stuff, just old retired guy stuff. He helped me load this massive 1950s Whirly into the back of my mate's van that I'd borrow for the day. I just felt something was off about the whole setup. Just something a bit Royston Vasey about it all. He, his wife, his 40-something daughter, his early 20s granddaughter, and his young great-granddaughter all lived together. Nice house, nice garden, not a nice vibe. Sometime later, it transpired that he had been arrested and carted off to jail. His granddaughter and great-granddaughter? Yeah, he'd fathered both of them. 30 years or so later, I still have the organ. I can't figure out what to do with it. I should sell it, but it's so heavy, and they'd want me to move it. An acquaintance, Tommy, let's call him, got a hammer to the head in his sleep, hit by his girlfriend because his mother died and left him a small estate, like $10,000 in a car. During eval at the psych ward, she said she didn't want him to leave her because he had money now. So she purchased a hammer and waited till he was sleeping and went frenzy on his head with the hammer. He lived and is doing fine. She was literally tiny and not enough strength to swing powerful enough to do anything other than wake him up with a skull fracture and lots of blood everywhere. She was covered too, because he had to wrestle or overpower her to survive. She scratched herself up, then had herself injuries before the police took her. During questioning, she claimed he attacked her, and she acted in self-defense. He was arrested and charged with serious charges. Only 6 months later did the CPS drop the charges after her admission of premeditation and purchasing of the hammer for this purpose. She's still locked up on a ward, I think 2 years on. He nearly went to jail for a long time. I was part of a testing team on a naval base in South America. Met a few lifers, including some recess. One in particular stood out, an older, now overweight dude with a thick mustache, but apparently in his day was a machine. Dude would constantly describe shooting civilians, children, pets, burning down villages during his years in Angola, and other delightful conversation topics. Knew full well it was all sanctioned, and he could say what he wanted with no repercussions. Eyes like a leopard seal, literally no light behind them. I'm gay and I dated a guy that used to lie and treat his poor employees like garbage. But when I broke up with him because of the mental abuse, he convinced the court to give him a protem domestic abuse restraining order because he falsely accused me of R-ing him, stalking him, and threatening to kill him with a gun. He got the idea from his psychopathic sister, who would make up lies about all of her ex-boyfriends when they tried to dump her and even badly injured herself and make it look like they did it so they would go to jail. Long story short, I fought it in court, and with a lot of evidence in my favor, along with his stupidity of lying to the court and skipping a court date to go skiing instead, it was dropped, and he was ordered to pay my legal fees. Moral of the story, learn to spot these people, because if you don't, your life can be ruined overnight. Sitting in the basement with him between me and the only exit, he piss-drunk late at night, describing in detail how he used his connections to find a person who R-ed his sister and murdered them. He described it in extreme detail, what it's like to kill someone and watch their life fade from their eyes. He was from the mental ward at the hospital my sibling was at. My sibling brought him home because they were dating. They met at a said ward. I later learned most of the details were made up, except the murder. He also burned the person's corpse and went on a joyride with their girlfriend using the victim's credit cards. And yes, this was the first time I met him. Trigger warning. When a former coworker said he was glad no women were on the project because they always screw everything up, and he leaned over to me, I was still a young man, with the creepiest glare in his eyes and said, "It's a good thing they have a gash, right? Ugh, that's all they're good for." As if I was supposed to agree with that and be okay with it. Then he talked about wanting to go to a strip club so we could drug and R-word some women. I was stuck traveling with him for a week, but I did report him when I got back. Not for my sake, but for any unfortunate woman that might have to be stuck working with him. He didn't last very long after that, and I don't think it was because of me either. When I met my now wife's mom, I knew she wasn't quite right. Her smile seemed fake, and everything about her seemed like she was a person acting instead of a person just being. Over time, the facade would crack and later crumble. It started with seeing how she treated customer service people who did nothing wrong. At a restaurant and her steak was undercooked, she would scream at the server right off the bat. The server, who obviously didn't cook the meal, and she would nearly pass out from lack of oxygen and her blood pressure going up so high. The oh shit moment for me was when I was supposed to drop my then girlfriend off at the airport. Still living at home, I went to pick her up, and her dad told me her mom has already taken her. So I drove to the airport. This is college, and I'm not going to see her for 3 months, so I wanted to see her off. I get there, I know the security gate she'll go through, and I don't see her. I call her cell from a payphone, this was a while ago, and get no answer. So I'm a bit worried. So I try a few more times, and nothing. I ask the airport for information about her, like did she check in or board her flight, but since she's not my wife at the time, they won't tell me. Jack. I have no desire to see her mom, but I want to make sure my girlfriend is okay. So I wait and wait and wait, but her mom never shows either. To this day, I have no clue how her mom left the airport without me seeing her. It was much smaller back then. Eventually, I go home, and not long after her mom shows up, and sounds like she's trying to break the door down. I open it, and she's screaming at me. "This is my daughter. You'll never marry her. I'll make sure of that," and so much more. She's completely unhinged. I tell her I'm calling the police, and she's gone before they show up. This is long before ring cams and whatnot, so they won't do anything since it's my word versus hers. And they can't get a protective order because those are much harder to get than most people think. I wish I could say we went out of contact with her mom after this, but my now wife desperately wanted a relationship with her mom, so she tried for years after to make it work, but I refused to be alone with her mom after that. About a decade later, her mom freaked out like this on my wife when our kids were young, 5 and 8, and my wife finally agreed it was time. My wife thinks her mom is just unstable, but I genuinely do not believe her mom cares about anyone beside herself. She never praised her kids to people. Instead, she would say, "My daughter is so smart, and it's because," and go into a 5-minute story about how she sacrificed everything for her kids, how they're ungrateful, how she's super talented, and so on. If you talk to her, she only talks about what she wants to talk about. She'll hijack every conversation and make it about her. When her now dead husband had to go to the hospital, the only thing she, my wife's mom, could talk about was how stressful it was for her, how hard things were for her, and how she was mad. Life couldn't be easier. Her husband died, and not once did she say anything positive about him. Not sure she would ever kill anyone, but only because if she did, she knows she could end up in jail, and she wouldn't like that. I still grieve my wife's dad's passing, and it pains me that out of the two of them, he was the one that went first. He wasn't perfect, but he did genuinely care about his kids and grandkids.